There's a drawer in your kitchen right now. Maybe it's the second one down. Maybe it's tucked beside the stove. And inside that drawer, pushed to the back behind the peelers and the tongs and that one mystery tool you bought at a farmer's market and never used, there are knives. Knives that used to be sharp. Knives that cost you real money. Knives that now slide across a tomato like you're trying to cut it with a ruler. You've probably blamed yourself. Maybe you're not storing them right. Maybe you're washing them wrong. Maybe you just need a better knife. So you buy a new one, and for a few weeks, everything is glorious. Clean cuts, effortless slices, the kind of cooking that actually feels satisfying. And then, quietly, gradually, almost without you noticing, that knife goes dull too. And it joins the others. Here's the thing nobody tells you. It's not the knife. It's not your technique. It's not even how often you're sharpening. It's where you're cutting. Every single time you drag a blade across a surface, something happens to that edge. And the surface you're using, the one sitting right there on your counter, could be the thing that's been silently destroying your knives for years. There is a solution. It's not a gadget. It doesn't plug in. It doesn't require a subscription or a certification or a YouTube tutorial with 17 steps. It's a single wooden block, one specific kind. And it works so quietly, so steadily, that people who switch to it often don't even realize it's working until they look back and realize they haven't sharpened a knife in over a year. This is the story of why that block exists, why it works, and why the people who profit from dull knives would very much prefer you never find out about it. So let's talk about the sharpening industry, because it is, genuinely, a thriving business. Whetstones, electric sharpeners, pull-through gadgets, honing rods, ceramic sticks, leather strops, diamond-coated plates. There are entire YouTube channels, entire subreddits, entire communities of passionate, knowledgeable people devoted to the art and science of putting an edge back on a blade. And look, some of that is legitimate. Some of that is craft. There are sharpening professionals who have spent decades developing a real and remarkable skill, and the results they produce are genuinely beautiful. But here's what none of them are telling you. Sharpening is a response. It is the thing you do after damage has already been done. Every time you run a blade across a stone, no matter how fine, no matter how expertly, you are removing metal. You are grinding away a tiny fraction of the knife that will never come back. A knife that gets sharpened regularly doesn't stay the same knife forever. It gets thinner. The geometry changes. The blade narrows. Over years, over decades, a well-used knife that gets sharpened constantly becomes a shadow of what it once was. You've seen it. The old chef's knife that's been loved down to almost nothing. That's not wear from cutting food. That's wear from sharpening. And the industry knows this. The entire model depends on a cycle. Your knife goes dull. You sharpen it. It goes dull again. You buy a better sharpener, or a better stone, or a better knife, because surely the problem is the steel. And then that knife goes dull too, and the wheel keeps turning. It is not a conspiracy exactly. It is just the natural shape of a business that profits from a problem it has very little incentive to solve permanently. Now ask yourself, when was the last time someone selling you a sharpener talked seriously about why your knife is going dull in the first place? Not just that it goes dull, but why? What is happening physically to that edge between one sharpening session and the next? Because if you understood that, really understood the mechanics of it, you would immediately start asking a very different question. Not how do I restore this edge, but how do I stop destroying it? The edge of a knife is not just thin, it is microscopically thin. We're talking about a structure so fine that it can be distorted, folded, or chipped by forces that feel completely routine to us. Pressing down on a hard surface, the friction of dragging across glass, the impact of meeting ceramic or stone, or the hard mineral deposits baked into a plastic board. Every cut on the wrong surface is a small act of violence against an edge that has almost no tolerance for abuse. And here's where the dirty little secret lives. The cutting surface, the thing the blade lands on every single time, is doing more damage to your knife than almost anything else in your kitchen. More than the food itself. More than how you wash it. More than whether you store it in a drawer or on a magnetic strip. The surface is the variable that sharpening evangelists almost never discuss, because the surface, if you get it right, removes them from the equation entirely. One material exists that doesn't just tolerate a blade, it actually works with it. It gives way just slightly at the moment of contact, cushioning the edge instead of grinding against it. It lets the knife do its job and sends it back undamaged, again and again, for years. That material is wood, but not just any wood, not just any cut or configuration. The specific kind matters enormously, and that's exactly where we're going next. So let's talk about wood. Because when most people hear wooden cutting board, they picture the thing their grandmother had sitting on the counter, maybe a little warped, maybe a little stained, probably made from whatever cheap pine plank someone grabbed at the hardware store. And if that's the image in your head, it's worth setting aside, because what we're actually talking about is something far more specific, and the difference between getting it right and getting it wrong is the entire ballgame. Wood, as a material, has a relationship with a knife edge that no synthetic surface can replicate. The reason comes down to cellular structure. Wood is not a solid mass. It's a network of long tubular cells, essentially tiny hollow channels running through the grain, channels that carried water and nutrients when the tree was alive. When a knife blade makes contact with wood, those cells don't resist the edge the way ceramic or hard plastic does. They compress slightly. They yield. The blade enters the surface and the fibers around it give way just enough to absorb the impact, then close back around the path the knife made. The edge is never grinding against something harder than itself. It's being received. Now here's where the configuration matters. When you look at a conventional wooden board, the kind cut from a plank with the grain running lengthwise across the surface, you're looking at what's called face grain or edge grain. The long fibers are running parallel to the cutting surface, and when a knife lands across them, it's landing across the sides of those tubular channels. The blade can still slip between fibers, but it's also pushing them sideways. And over time, those lateral cuts accumulate into grooves and channels that actually trap bacteria, and more importantly for our purposes, begin to work against the edge rather than with it. End grain is different. Fundamentally, structurally different. An end grain board is built by taking individual blocks of wood, turning them so the cut ends of the fibers face upward, and bonding them together into a surface. What you're looking at when you look down at an end grain board is thousands of those hollow channels, all pointing straight up at you, like the bristles of a brush. And when a knife comes down into that surface, it doesn't cut across the fibers. It slides between them. The channels open slightly to receive the blade, and then, because wood has a natural memory and resilience, they close back up. This is sometimes described as a self-healing surface, which sounds like marketing language until you actually understand what's happening at the cellular level. It's not healing in any dramatic sense. It's simply that the fibers were never severed. They were parted, and then they returned. The implications for a blade are significant. A knife edge, at the microscopic level, is a series of tiny aligned teeth, a geometry that takes considerable effort and skill to create and almost no effort at all to destroy. When that geometry meets end grain, it finds a surface that accommodates it. When it meets face grain, it finds moderate resistance. When it meets plastic or stone, it finds something that doesn't give it all, and the edge pays the price with every single cut. The wood species matters too, though perhaps less than the grain orientation. The ideal range sits somewhere in the medium hardness zone, Maple is the benchmark that most professionals point to. Hard enough to resist deep scarring from the blade, soft enough to maintain that crucial give. Teak can work, though its silica content introduces complications. Walnut is slightly softer, very forgiving, excellent for finer blades. What you want to avoid are the extremes. Wood so soft that the blade sinks and drags, and wood so hard that the surface stops yielding and starts fighting back. One board, one orientation, one species range. And every blade you own starts living a completely different life from the moment it first touches the surface. So let's talk about what actually happens over time. Because this isn't just a theory about what should occur when steel meets end grain. There's a measurable, observable difference that accumulates with every single use, every single day, across months and then years. Think about what a sharp blade really is. It's a maintained geometry. That's all. Sharpness isn't a material property that gets added to a knife. It's a structural condition that either gets preserved or destroyed depending on what the edge contacts repeatedly. And this is where end grain stops being interesting and starts being remarkable. Every time you bring a blade down onto an end grain surface, the wood fibers compress, part, and this is the part most people never consider, they recover. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough. The cell structure of end grain has a memory to it, a resilience that face grain and certainly plastic never possess. What this means in practice is that the surface you're cutting on today is functionally very similar to the surface you were cutting on 6 months ago. It self-regulates in a way that no synthetic material can replicate. Now multiply that across the life of a knife. A home cook might use a primary blade 300, 400 times a year. Over a decade, that's somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 contacts with a cutting surface. On plastic, each one of those contacts introduces microscopic lateral stress to the edge geometry. Tiny deformations, small rollings and foldings of the steel that compound invisibly until one day you reach for a knife that used to feel effortless, and it drags. It resists. It requires pressure instead of responding to guidance. You barely noticed it happening because it happened gradually, and that gradual quality is exactly what makes it so insidious. On end grain, that same 3,000 to 4,000 contacts looks entirely different under magnification. The edge returns from each cut with its alignment largely intact. The teeth, those microscopic aligned teeth that define what sharpness actually is, stay oriented. They don't fold. They don't roll. The cumulative damage that would have made that knife feel like a completely different tool by year 3 simply doesn't accumulate at the same rate. What this produces, practically speaking, is a blade that still feels responsive after years of regular use. Not because it's never needed sharpening, it will, eventually, but because the intervals between sharpening stretch dramatically. A knife that might have needed professional attention twice a year on a plastic board might need it once every 2 or 3 years on quality end grain. The math on that alone, the time, the cost, the sheer inconvenience of repeatedly restoring edges that shouldn't have been damaged in the first place, is staggering once you actually sit with it. One surface, used consistently, and the blade you've had for 10 years still performs the way it did closer to day 1 than you would ever have believed possible. So here's the question that naturally follows all of that. If end grain wood genuinely extends the life of a blade this dramatically, if the science is straightforward, the physics are well understood, and the results are measurable, why hasn't anyone in the knife and kitchen industry been shouting this from the rooftops? Why haven't the cooking shows mentioned it? Why haven't the professional sharpeners built their entire brand around it? The answer is uncomfortable, but it's also fairly simple. Dull knives are a business model. Think about what the sharpening industry actually sells. It sells whetstones, pull-through sharpeners, electric systems, honing rods, professional services, replacement blades. It sells courses. It sells subscriptions to sharpening services. It sells the identity of the person who really knows how to maintain a blade. Every single one of those products and services depends on one foundational assumption: that your knives will keep getting dull and that you'll keep needing help with them. Now imagine telling that entire ecosystem that a $60 cutting board significantly reduces how often you need any of it. That's not a message that moves product. That's a message that quietly ends repeat business. It's not a conspiracy exactly. Nobody sat in a room and agreed to hide the end grain research. It's more subtle than that. Industries promote what benefits them, and the information that circulates most freely is almost always the information that someone has a financial reason to share. Sharpen your knives more often. Use this system. Buy this tool. The cutting surface beneath those knives? That part of the conversation just never gets funded. And so the average home cook spends years buying expensive knives, dulling them faster than necessary, paying to restore them, and repeating that cycle, never once realizing that the surface they're cutting on is the variable nobody bothered to mention. Not because it doesn't matter, because it matters too much. So what should you actually look for? First, confirm its true end grain construction. The face showing the wood's rings, not the long side of the plank. Maple and walnut are the standards. Dense enough to be durable, soft enough to let the fibers separate cleanly. Size matters too. Bigger surface means more usable cutting area before you're working the same worn patch repeatedly. Keep it oiled. Food-grade mineral oil, applied regularly, prevents cracking and keeps those fibers pliable. Wash it by hand, never the dishwasher. Let it dry flat. That's genuinely the entire maintenance routine. Demanding it is not. One block, one decision. That's really what it comes down to. You don't need a sharpening subscription. You don't need a drawer full of steel rods and ceramic sticks and leather strops you'll use twice. You need a well-made piece of end-grain wood sitting on your counter, doing its quiet work every single time a blade touches it. The knives you already own are probably good knives. They just haven't had a surface that treated them that way. Give them one and see what changes. If this shifted something for you, share it with someone who cooks. Because the best kept secrets are only secrets until someone finally says them out loud.